to this webinar to launch externally the knowledge guide on crop receipts that will discuss various aspects of pre-harvest finance, focusing on this relatively new financing instrument called crop receipts. We have a program for you that consists of some welcoming and introductory remarks. After the welcoming remarks and introductory remarks from Irene from SECO, we'll have a joint presentation of the guide itself. The presentation will explain what crop receipts are, will provide illustrations of their uses, some practical application, as well as some of the challenges that some jurisdictions have encountered in reforming their legislation to deploy crop receipts. Then we will move into the panel presentation, which will start with Will from UniDroit. One of the objectives of the knowledge guide was to lay the foundation for a model law, future model law at UniDroit for crop receipts to foster harmonization as more and more projects are undertaken in various parts of the world that the panelists will cover in their presentations. We will hear from FAO, for instance, that will describe the initial phase of the Ukraine project on crop receipts and some of the challenges that were encountered at that time. FAO will also provide some insights into a reform project in Serbia. We'll also hear from IFAD that will highlight the importance of solutions that support smallholder farmers and their products from farm to fork, as well as some early experiences from an initiative on crop receipts in Kenya. Then we'll have a speaker from Rabo Partnerships that will focus on the initiative to foster pre-harvest finance in selected African economies, including Rwanda, Nigeria, and Ethiopia. They recently published a very useful study on unlocking agriculture finance at scale, particularly for smallholders, that is available on their website. And then finally, we'll hear from John Wilson, who is joining us from Peru, and he will summarize for us some of the World Bank Group's initiatives in agriculture finance, as well as the possible introduction of crop receipts in Peru. The program will close with a 15-minute Q&A session. I encourage attendees to submit their questions via chat. In order to move smoothly through the agenda, we'll skip introductions of the speakers whose short bios have been included on the webinar's website. I will guide you through the entire program. I should have introduced myself at the outset. My name is Marek Dubovec. I represent the International Law Institute that jointly with Kyrillos Group at the IFC developed the knowledge guide. So without further ado, I will turn over the floor to Irene from SECO to provide us introduction to this initiative and how SECO has helped so far funding various initiatives in the realm of crop receipts. Irene, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Marek, and good morning and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on the knowledge guide on crop receipts finance. Let me start by thanking the International Law Institute and IFC for actually hosting this event. And it's great to see such a strong group of international organizations and financial institutions and technical experts joining us today. From SECO's perspective as a donor, we are very pleased to have supported the development of this guide. This guide is not just a theoretical document, but it draws on more than a decade of practical experience with crop receipts finance across different countries and regions. And as a donor, we place strong emphasis on sharing and scaling lessons from the programs we are supporting. As you all know, access to finance remains a major challenge for farmers and agribusinesses, especially in emerging and transition economies where traditional lending models often fall short. That's why for us at SECO, it's very important to invest in innovative but practical solutions and crop receipts finance is one such example. We have been working with IFC on crop and warehouse receipts actually for more than 10 years. Our collaboration has started in Ukraine, and we will hear more about Ukraine today. But in Ukraine specifically, crop receipts have proven their value even under extreme difficult conditions, including the ongoing war with major market disruption and high uncertainty for both farmers and lenders. And despite these challenges, the system has continued to function, and we have recently also reached a major milestone with Ukraine introducing electronic crop receipts, or agrarian notes as it is called, establishing them also as a recognized security instruments. More recently, we have also started working with IFC in other partner countries of our international cooperation, namely Albania, Kosovo, South Caucasus, and Peru. And our experience from these programs shows that there are a few key success factors for establishing crop receipts markets. First, strong legal and institutional foundations are essentials. Clear laws, enforceable creditor rights, reliable registries, workable enforcement mechanisms. This is really the basis and almost basically a precondition for us to engage. Without these, trust does not develop, and without trust, markets will not develop. And secondly, capacity building really matters. A wide range of stakeholders, farmers, banks, financial institutions, input suppliers, registry operators, notaries, enforcement authorities, they all need to understand how this instrument works and what their roles are. And this is why we, in our programs, place a very strong emphasis on training, capacity building, and knowledge sharing. And third, while there are core principles, strong laws, trusted institutions, stakeholder capacity are the same across countries, crop receipt markets cannot simply be copied from one context to another. Each country has its own legal system, market structure, and institutional capacities. And that's why for successful markets have to be built and cannot just be copied. And finally, collaboration also matters. Long-term coordination between government, the private sector, market institutions is essential to sustain the system and build confidence among market participants. This thinking is also reflected in our broader donor approach. Our objective is to support systems that work in practice and that can be sustained by local actors over time. And a key part of that approach is to ensure that the lessons learned and the experiences from our programs are shared more widely as a global public good, so that others can benefit and build on what has worked. And this is precisely where this knowledge guide on crop receipts finance adds value. It provides practical guidance on legal, regulatory, and institutional building blocks that are needed for crop receipts to work responsibly and sustainably. And it also represents an important step toward greater legal harmonization, which could eventually lead to a model law. So let me just conclude with a simple hope for today's webinar. And that is that this guide will be used as a practical tool, and that today's discussion will help to connect legal, financial, and agricultural perspectives. And I also would like to thank the International Law Institute and IFC for their excellent work in developing this guide. The team has invested a lot of efforts and time to actually put this practical lessons together and make the guide accessible and useful for practitioners. I myself am not a specialist, but I was reading through it and I found it really very user-friendly. So thank you all for joining today, and I look forward to the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Irene, for those welcoming and introductory remarks. I think you already touched on several key issues that will be further developed in the following presentations. I just want to highlight a couple of those as a transition to the joint presentation of the knowledge guide. You referred to crop receipts and then agrarian notes. Indeed, crop receipt is not a term that is universally used, and when we speak to various stakeholders on the ground and we describe the functionalities to them, they often say, well, we already have this. We just call it something else, or we can construct the equivalent of the crop receipt or an agrarian note from the particular features of the legal system. So this program and the guide itself is not technically only on crop receipts, it's on pre-harvest financing that takes a particular shape and form. Secondly, you highlighted the importance of solid legal foundations, which is quite important to provide certainty and comfort to lenders who will eventually provide financing on the strength of crop receipts. One can construct crop receipts, as we will hear in the next presentation, from the existing elements of the legal framework, but we'll see how some specific features of the crop receipts, many of which you highlighted, registries, strong enforcement rights, priorities, how those are critical to provide that certainty and predictability. So without further ado, I'm turning over the floor to Kirilo, who will kick us off with the presentation on the guide, and then he will share the floor with Thomas Johnson from ILI, who will wrap this up. Kirilo, please.
Yeah, thank you so much, Marek. I'm just curious if Tom will pull up the slides, but I would like to say good morning and welcome everyone to this webinar. Today, we are happy to introduce the Knowledge Guide on Crop Receipts Finance, our first baby 5C ILI collaboration, which we aim to design to help countries to unlock the so needed pre-harvest finance for farmers by kind of making the attempt to standardize the legal framework for the benefit of other states. This is not just creating a product, but working on the legal framework needed for the future agricultural finance in general. As we rightly mentioned already, that agriculture remains underfinanced in many jurisdictions globally, and especially the pre-harvest element is missing. Of course, smallholders cannot find enough eligible or bankable collateral that financial institutions would accept. And on top of that, there are still some climate change impact, which increase volatility and risk perception of creditors. And all of this, of course, contribute to food security resilience, which heavily depends on this type of financing. So there is no single jurisdiction which has enough of fixed assets which would be eligible according to Basel principles, right? So that's why we need to work on this instrument and introduce or help to introduce other jurisdictions this pre-harvest finance instruments. So essentially, when we speak about crop receipts, and I was lucky to be one of the implementers of these instruments in Ukraine since 2015 already, more than 10 years. So actually, this is the instrument of pre-harvest financing issued by farmers who own or have the legal rights to use the land. They can be normally in two forms, and these forms are different on the way of by the way of settlement of these crop receipts. We are speaking of physical or commodity crop receipts when farmers have to settle the obligation with the crop delivery, or financial crop receipts when they have to repay money after the harvest is sold. And of course, depending on the sophistication of the country development, then this instrument can exist in various form, either paper or electronic. Of course, given the trends, given the global trends for digitalization and decreasing the transactional cost, electronic is the most preferable form of the instrument. But what we really need to have the sense instruments operational is a strong legislation and registries that provides for transparency on the market, right? So to summarize, crop receipts is legally standardized promise by a farmer or agricultural producer either to deliver crops or pay money secured by the future harvest. So it's a hybrid instrument with the obligation, which in the countries that we are working on is unconditional to fulfill the farmer's obligation secured by future harvest. So it essentially converts some uncertain biological assets that will appear in the future into a bankable financial claim to the farmer. So in practice, crop receipts can work in various business models, and we are talking about forward contracts, contract farming, barter operations, maybe just conventional bank loans, but they essentially form the relationship of exchanging inputs for money, inputs for commodities, money for money, or money for commodities, right? So four various types of relationship between creditors or investors in agriculture and agricultural producers. And this experience came to us from Brazil, where this instrument was created in early 1990s, and then it was successfully replicated in Ukraine. And in our great cooperation with Swiss Confederation, it became a great catalyzer actually for private and some portion of it even was public investment in agriculture. So by now, this instrument facilitated almost 2.4 billion of US dollars of finance, which is quite significant for Ukraine, even in these very harsh times. This instrument still exists, and what is really notable is that in the worst year, the NPL on crop receipts did not exceed 4% of the total portfolio, which for this type of asset, the essentially ownership right for the future assets, I think it's pretty remarkable. So that's why, based on our experience in Brazil and in Ukraine, we are currently looking into other jurisdictions, and I'm speaking today from one of them, from Tirana in Albania, where, and apart from Albania, we have Kosovo, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, also emerging economies, but with a completely different agricultural landscape. But still, the instrument is so universal, so it can be applicable to any value chain, starting from really smallholder farmers to big agri-holdings, as we've got them in Ukraine and Brazil. Yeah, and what we faced with, and where this initial idea of designing the guide on crop receipts came into our mind, is that in every country that we are exploring the implementation of crop receipts, we faced with very similar issues and legislative, regulatory, and market gaps. So this instrument is able to create a sort of an ecosystem of all agricultural stakeholders to benefit from the increased access to finance. And um, contrary to the model law on warehouse receipts, we don't have a model law on crop receipts or whatever we call them, the instrument of pre-harvest finance to facilitate this journey for the states on the way of establishing the proper legislative and enabling environment to introduce crop receipts in the national reform agenda. So we really hope that with our partners, so we already made several steps and some announcements were made recently by UNIDROIT that we will likely commence our work on designing an agricultural finance guide with the crop receipts as an essential part of it. And at the end of the day, we will be happy to see the model law on crop receipts for the benefit of other nations and its agricultural producers. Now, probably stop here and pass the floor to my co-speaker and Tom. I will pass it over to you. The floor is yours, and we'll be happy to address any questions further on. Thank you so much.
Sure. Sure. Thank you, Kirilo, for that introduction. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Thomas Johnson. I'm a research attorney at ILI. I worked with Kirilo and Marek, and I think Taras and Agil might also be here from the IFC on this knowledge guide. Very interesting, Kirilo, to hear that the NPL or the non-performing loan rate is only 4% in Ukraine. That's a very interesting and practical kind of statistic. I had no idea. I'll kind of just continue through these slides if I can. First, I'll just go over the outline of the knowledge guide. The first part just goes into the economic rationale. We're all very familiar with the economic rationale for crop receipts and its relation to food security and other sustainable development goals. I think the important thing to emphasize, and Mark emphasized this in his introduction, and so did Kirilo, is that it's a pre-harvest agricultural instrument. Many of the agricultural guidance documents that are being published by the World Bank and IFC and other organizations also emphasize this, the need for access to credit at the pre-harvest stage, particularly for smallholder farmers, where it's very challenging due to lack of collateral. So crop receipts is kind of an instrument to address these constraints and challenges that smallholders face at this stage of the production cycle. So section 1 kind of goes into those bits. Section 2 discusses the concept and definition of crop receipts. Kirilo already discussed that in his introduction. Important thing to remember is there's two types. Not all jurisdictions have adopted both types, but there's the physical crop receipts, which relates to a future delivery of agricultural commodities. And then there's the financial crop receipt, which is based on or reflects a future payment of a sum of money, similar actually to a promissory note. Section 3 examines the laws governing specific aspects of crop receipts, and in particular, the secure transactions law. But I'll go into a list of other interrelated laws. There's a lot. Secure transactions is probably the biggest one. Looking at legislation in both Brazil and Ukraine, there's particular provisions governing security rights in growing crops and future crops as well. Next, we provided in section 4 a kind of outline again, based mainly on the crop receipts legislation in Brazil and Ukraine, but also international standards we integrated, such as the Uncontrolled Amount law and secure transaction. But an outline or the structure of a law on crop receipts. So Chapter 1, Chapter 2, we didn't draft any black letter rules, but we provided a useful structure that could be built upon later. I'll go into that in a little bit more detail. And finally, Section 5 briefly details the role of government and public support implementing crop receipts reforms. Oftentimes, crop receipts legislation will provide for the establishment of a crop receipts registry, either a new standalone registry, which was implemented in the paper system in Ukraine, or a securities registry, which is prevalent in the Brazilian market. I mentioned laws affecting crop receipts. I'll list them. One moment, please. I'll list them. Oh yeah, a very important one. Oh, excuse me. Very important one is farm organizations, particularly in Brazil. I don't know the practice in Ukraine or other countries, but farming organizations play a very important link between smallholder farmers, for example, and in the financial institutions or other value chain participants that accept crop receipts as a kind of collateral. So that's a very important element. I know Unidra is working on a project related to farm organizations as well. It's a very important aspect for agricultural finance in general, kind of as an aggregator. The next important aspect, and I'll go into a little bit more detail on this later, is property rights and movable and immovable property, classifying a growing crop or a future crop as either a movable type of property or a movable property, which often depends on the legislation in the jurisdiction. Secure transactions I mentioned, negotiable instruments I mentioned. Remember, the financial crop receipts actually has a lot in common with promissory notes. Actually, in the Argentina context, they kind of just modified their law on promissory notes to accommodate promissory notes covering future payment rights in relation to agricultural commodities. Then there's negotiable documents or documents of title. In some jurisdictions, physical crop receipts are classified as negotiable documents. That's true in Ukraine, for example. We mentioned digitalization. There's been a move towards digital assets and electronic transferable records. Crop receipts have been digitized in the Brazilian market, and as well as Ukraine recently passed legislation on digital crop receipts as well. And then finally, securities and financial instruments are also important. This is one area that is very attractive to people in development. The ability to kind of convert crop receipts, aggregate them, and then convert them into a security that can actually be traded on the capital market. I don't know personally who the investors would be. I would assume mostly international financial institutions, but maybe even commercial banks. In some jurisdictions, for example, they are subject to mandatory lending quotas, and purchasing crop receipts might be a way, for example, to meet those requirements. Here's kind of how, again, based on Brazil and Argentina, how a structure of a law on crop receipts might look. Typically, there'll be a section on definitions and scope, providing definitions of crop receipts. In the Ukraine and Brazilian example, there's definitions of financial crop receipts and physical crop receipts in the legislations, but also other definitions as well as scope. What types of agricultural commodities can crop receipts cover? Again, Marek emphasized this, and so did Carrillo. It's not just crops grown on the ground necessarily, but all types of assets can be covered by a crop receipts, including livestock, for example. And in the Brazilian context, actually, it also can facilitate equipment financing. Similar to a law on warehouse receipts, there's also typically a section detailing the requirements to issue a valid crop receipts and the required information that must be contained in a crop receipt. Both universally, we've seen establishment of a crop receipts registry. There's different approaches. You can either leverage an existing registry, for example, one that's already used on the securities market, or create a standalone registry. Also, there's complexities and uncertainty around, does registration in a crop receipts registry perfect the security right in the future crop? So that's an issue that is complex and needs to be addressed. There's always either in a standalone chapter or specific provision rules governing security rights in the crops, particularly future agricultural commodities. So that's often detailed in the law on crop receipts, and that kind of supplements the general secured transactions law. There's also rules, again, similar to warehouse receipts legislation, on how crop receipts are transferred. Unlike warehouse receipts finance, where the warehouse receipt is actually transferred to the financial institution. Here, it's the borrower who acts as the issuer. So they issue the crop receipts to the financial institution or the finance provider, and then that finance provider could, because it's a kind of negotiable type instrument, transfer that to subsequent holders. So there's often rules on that as well. And if we're talking about digital crop receipts, there'll have to be separate rules for digital crop receipts versus paper as well. So those are detailed in the laws as well. And then finally, there are enforcement provisions, often very strong enforcement provisions, particularly in the Ukrainian context, about what happens in the event of default, rights to enter the land and take possession or take control of the production process. So that's a general outline. Moving forward, some of the key legal issues, I talked about this a little bit earlier. One issue we faced in a lot of jurisdictions is how do you classify crop receipts? It's not just a kind of academic issue. Because for example, if you classify a crop receipts as a securities, for example, it could trigger a bunch of requirements that the smallholder as an issuer could never meet. So that's one area that jurisdictions should be careful. Ukraine has, I think, largely solved this issue by classifying as a special type of security, kind of a private security that doesn't have these requirements. But it's something that should be taken into account, certainly when drafting crop receipts legislation, including other areas, other classifications that can cause issues are negotiable documents. Again, a crop receipt relates to future agricultural commodities or rights to future agricultural commodities, whereas traditionally a negotiable document relates to existing ones, like a crop that's already stored in a warehouse. And then again, negotiable instruments, that's, for example, promissory notes. A financial crop receipts, or at least a paper financial crop receipts, has a lot in common with a promissory notes. And in some cases, in Argentina, for example, the existing regime for negotiable instruments could be extended to agricultural commodities. Another issue that I touched upon earlier is the property law status of growing crops or future crops. Particularly with respect to growing crops, a priority conflict can arise, for example, between a financial institution that has a kind of mortgage interest or mortgage right in relation to the land that a crop is grown, and then another financial institution that has a security right in the crops growing on that land, for example, crops covered by a crop receipts. So that can create conflict. So the law should address that. I mentioned the establishment of a crop receipts registry. There's lots of complexities involving the registry system and can be the relationship, for example, between a collateral registry and a crop receipts registry and what the legal effect of registration of the crop receipt in the crop receipts registry has, particularly with respect to third-party effectiveness. Again, states can either adopt a standalone crop receipts registry or use an existing registry. Another important legal issue that we've encountered, especially in relation to digitalization, is treatment of electronic crop receipts, and in particular, the laws governing the transfer of electronic crop receipts. Most of the laws we've looked at in Ukraine and Brazil, transfer is achieved by transfer is achieved by registration in the crop receipts registry, including by using kind of a digital signature. An alternative that states might consider choosing, or a different approach states might consider choosing, is using the method of control, which is also the recommended approach for electronic warehouse receipts in the recent law on or model law on warehouse receipts. Briefly on some of the future, So there's kind of two approaches that we can take for in terms of future work. Some states, few, not many, but I don't have a complete list. And as Marek mentioned earlier, some states may already have devices that function similarly to crop receipts and aren't actually called crop receipts. But for states that have already enacted legislation providing for crop receipts, future work could involve amendments to other laws to ensure coordination, ensure that the secure transactions law, for example, aligns with crop receipts legislation and vice versa. Drafting, implementing regulations, for example, regulations concerning registration of crop receipts and the legal effect of registration of crop receipts. Capacity building exercises for different types of stakeholders, smallholder farmers, for example, farm organizations, staff at banks, as well as actually designing pre-harvest agricultural finance products that are supported by crop receipts. So actually using this new instrument and designing products around those instruments. And then finally, for states that are considering enactment of legislation providing for crop receipts, this is where all the knowledge guide will also come in handy, is assessment of the existing legal and regulatory framework supporting agricultural finance. A legal assessment is very important, obviously, a market study, also identifying value chains where these instruments could be deployed, as well as actually drafting legislation. So I'm approaching my time now, so I'll end my presentation. Again, thank you all for your time and support.
Thank you, Kirill and Thomas, and for the presentation and sticking to your allocated time. You ended exactly as envisaged in the agenda, which allows us to move to the next segment of the program, which is a panel discussion. We'll proceed in the order of speakers as listed in the agenda, except that we'll swap Kevin and John, as John has a meeting to attend on crop receipts, interestingly, in Peru. So we'll start the panel with Will Bridie Watson's presentation that will talk to agricultural finance work from the perspective of UNIDROIT. And as we have heard already throughout the program, there is an increasing need not only for solid legal, but also harmonized legal foundation, which is the line of business that UNIDROIT is in. There is also a pressing need for this type of model legislation given the increasing number of projects. We have heard about Brazil, Ukraine, Argentina that already have some laws on crop receipts, but we have also heard a list of jurisdictions that are considering already undertaking projects, such as in Kosovo, for whom this type of guidance, not only the knowledge guide, but also some form of harmonized legislation would be quite useful. And then finally, the slides themselves already refer to a future UNIDROIT project. So I'll turn over the floor to Will to describe to us what UNIDROIT can do for us.
Thank you very much, Marek, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be part of this webinar to launch this important new document. And I wanted to congratulate our friends at ILI and the IFC with the support of SECO for delivering this important knowledge guide. Now, as introduced by Marek, my presentation today is intended to put this new document in a broader context of agricultural law, agriculture and private law development, agriculture finance, and speak perhaps a little bit about future initiatives that we hope to involve everyone on this call in today. So for those of you who may be unfamiliar with UNIDROIT, we are the International Institute for the Unification of Private Law. We're an independent intergovernmental organization based in Rome, Italy, that came out of the League of Nations and then became a separate independent body in 1940. But as we were first launched in 1926, we are very pleased to be celebrating our 100th anniversary this year. So in the first 85 years of UNIDROIT's history, we worked on private law issues, primarily around international commercial contracts, cross-border proceedings, access to finance. But in the last 15 years, we've been very, very pleased to partner with our wonderful colleagues based in Rome in the field of agriculture. And that eventuated essentially because we're lucky enough in Rome to have the world's most important organizations in the field of agriculture, Food and Agriculture Organization, IFAD, WFP, etc. And it was determined that the value of having the world's leading expertise in the field based in Rome, as well as UNIDROIT with its focus on private law, allowed for a collaboration of to develop joint instruments in the field of agriculture and private law to facilitate agricultural development around the world. And we've had a number of successful projects in this field since this joint work began about 15 years ago. First, we had the UNIDROIT, FAO, and IFAD Legal Guide on Contract Farming, released in 2015, followed by the UNIDROIT and IFAD Legal Guide on Agricultural Land Investments in 2021. And as noted briefly by Thomas in his presentation, later this year, we intend to adopt a guidance document on collaborative structures for agricultural enterprises, which has also been developed in close consultation with our friends on this call. Now, turning more, these of course are broader legal guidance, not only in relation to agricultural access to finance, but providing clear, harmonized, uniform legal frameworks for agricultural development and production in general. More specifically in the field of access to credit in the agricultural context, we have the Mining, Agricultural and Construction Equipment Protocol to the Convention on International Interest in Mobile Equipment, or more colloquially, the MAC Protocol to the Cape Town Convention, which was a hard law treaty adopted in 2019 to provide specific finance solutions for high value equipment. We're talking tractors, harvesters, irrigators, to facilitate cross-border mechanization of the agricultural industry. And our most recent baby in this field is the UNCITRAL UNIDROIT Model Law on Warehouse Receipts, adopted in 2024. Now, we were very pleased to see that these instruments were utilized, relied on, and referenced throughout the knowledge guide. We think that this is very important for the knowledge guide to sort of reflect and recognize these international best practices to the extent that they could affect crop receipt finance. And we're also pleased to see the reference of other important international standards prepared by our sister organization, UNCITRAL. So, and then by way of example of that, we were very pleased to see the acknowledgement of contract farming as a technique to agricultural finance in part 2A of the guide. So we at UNIDROIT have reviewed the guide very carefully. We find it to be very well written, highlighting the important broad issues associated with the development of legal frameworks for the facilitation of crop receipts, and very well adapted to its audience of policymakers, regulators, and other stakeholders. And as introduced by Kirilo and Thomas, we're very pleased to see these excellent examples of on-the-ground experiences in Brazil, in Ukraine, references to Argentina and Serbia, tying our legal theoretical issues to real-world examples and what's actually happening around the world. I wanted to quickly touch on, I'm probably preaching to the converted to some extent in speaking about this, but we at Unidwire have found there is demonstrable real-world impact in improving legal frameworks in the field of access to credit. And this is noted very briefly in the knowledge guide. But from the Unidwire experience, Marek and I worked very closely, actually also with John Wilson on the call, on the preparation of a model law on factoring, which aimed at providing cross-border access to finance for SMEs, which was adopted just a few years ago in 2023 with assistance from our friends at different international financial institutions. That's now been implemented in about a dozen countries around the world. And several of those countries, since the implementation of these laws, have seen the increase of access to credit for SMEs in the order of over hundreds of millions of dollars, which for these small organizations, for these small enterprises that weren't previously part of the global supply chain in relation to the provision of goods and services, this is a huge real-world impact for what might seem from the outside to be a relatively dry and technical model law. And that's why we're very pleased to see this focus on pre-harvest agriculture. Now, turning to potential future initiatives, Unidwire, as has already been referenced several times during this webinar, the Unidwire Triennial Work Program for 2026 to 2028 was adopted by our General Assembly in December last year, and we're very pleased that both our Governing Council and General Assembly has agreed to undertake a new project to develop an agricultural financing legal guide. This was a proposal made by the United States government and accepted by our organs. Now, this proposed project aims to take stock of existing best practices in agricultural financing and to offer within a single instrument a coherent and comprehensive framework to support financing in the agricultural sector. Now, while existing guidance documents tend to focus on specific transactions, the value of this project lies in its holistic approach, covering the full spectrum of transactions across the entire agricultural supply chain. So ironically, we understand the need for this additional instrument is not because there's not enough instruments in the field. There are almost too many different instruments in the field without explanation as to how they join up. So when you go to a country and they are seeking assistance from an international organization to improve access to credit in agriculture, the challenge right now is that you have probably half a dozen different legal instruments, probably a dozen legal guidance documents, and it might be a little bit overwhelming for the policymakers, the government, the regulators in this country to know where to start. And the idea of this new instrument that we want to work on collectively with all of you is to provide a short explanation as to how each of these instruments relate to each other, how you can use them to create a comprehensive, broader framework, and to put them all in context to make sure none of them get lost. So the future guide has essentially 4 aims at this point. Of course, these will adapt as we start developing it. One is to provide a comprehensive overview of the transactions most commonly used to access finance, with particular emphasis on asset-based financing and leasing, a stock-taking exercise that we want to undertake for less developed jurisdictions. 2, we want to offer a list of existing best practices and standards, reflecting current practices in the distribution of agricultural commodities. 3, identify the relevant standards for each transaction, part of the supply chain, and present an explanation on how the different standards can work together along that supply chain. And 4, finally, highlight gaps in existing frameworks and lay the groundwork for the development of potential future standards where needed. Now, in relation to that 4th objective, it's already clear from this call in previous discussions Unidwire has had that there does seem to be a need, and potentially a pressing need, for the development of a model law on crop receipts. And part of the scope of the working group to develop this agricultural finance guide, once it's been created, will be to consider whether that initiative potentially needs to be prioritised over the development of the broader guide. It's a bit of a chicken and egg scenario in that sense. In terms of timeline, we intend to host an international meeting probably in April to discuss the scope of the future agricultural finance legal guide. And then the working group of international legal experts will begin its work in the second half of 2026. And we look forward to inviting not only our friends in Rome, FAO, IFAD and WFP, but also the ILI, the IFC, the World Bank, EBRD, ADB and other interested organisations to participate in this new project. So once again, congratulations to ILI, IFC and SECO again on this excellent initiative. Congratulations on the launch of the Knowledge Guide, and we look forward to future collaboration with you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Will, for that excellent presentation that highlighted the many projects that UNIDROIT has undertaken on its own, but also with many of its partners, including IFAD, IFC, FAO, as well as UNCITRAL, and some of them have been quite successful, as you pointed out yourself. We are quite excited about the new project at UNIDROIT that will connect the dots, so to speak, so that pre-harvest financing is properly connected to post-harvest financing, such as on warehouse receipts, and leads eventually to the sale of the commodity that generates a receivable that could be factored or used as collateral under general secure transactions laws. So this type of guidance would be quite useful to create a viable ecosystem or a market. So the next presenter is Katie Megan from IFAD, who will walk us through some of their initiatives, as well as how they consider supporting crop receipts going forward. And she will also provide some remarks on what has been said by Will in conjunction with their collaboration with UNIDROIT. Katie?
Thanks so much, Mark, and really delighted to be here today with everyone, and a big thanks to ILI and IFC for the invitation. So my name is Katie Megan. I'm the Chief Legal and Governance Officer at IFAD. You might know the International Fund for Agricultural Development. We're the only international financial institution that's laser focused on investing in rural agricultural development. 80% of the extreme poor live in rural areas, and that's extremely why we're focused there. And so I think that today's discussion on crop receipts really resonates deeply with me. I'd say, Mark, I don't know if you agree with this analysis, but we've heard, really, I think, important legal overview, legal insights, and maybe now in the second part of the panel discussion, along with John and Kevin and Dimitro, we're going to kind of move from the legal theory, and we're going to start digging our fingers in the dirt and tell you guys, how do you really see this on the ground from the smallholder farmer's perspective? And, that's a really important perspective that I think we have to always be thinking about when we're looking at new instruments. How are they really supporting the development of these farmers? I'd like to just start, first with some data around this. Second, why we need farm to fork solutions. And I'll give a short example from India there. And then third, talking really more about crop and warehouse receipts on the ground, where I'll give an example from Kenya. So data, I love to start with data. Smallholder farmers number between 450 and 500 million globally. That's roughly the population of everyone in North America. So it's quite a lot of people, and they're responsible for producing up to 80% of the world's food. It's a lot of food. Of course, it depends on the region, the statistics, but as mentioned in the Knowledge Guide on crop receipts, they face a staggering finance gap of $170 billion annually. So anything we can do, as was just mentioned by Will and others, to close that gap by using financial instruments in clever and efficient ways, I think is really critical, especially in this kind of era of declining ODA and finance really to those who need it the most. I think we'd all agree that these small-scale farmers lack adequate access to finance, but at the same time, they're kind of the backbone of food production. I think we all are seeing more and more as geopolitics play out that food security is directly also linked to national security and global security. So these are really important issues. EFOD invests every year about $3 billion in the first mile. A lot of people call it the last mile, the very rural areas. We call it the first mile because that's where food production starts. And we really work to link those smallholder farmers to the value chain and the markets. So not just that they're producing enough for subsistence farming, but they're actually making viable, sustainable agri-businesses. And with the current portfolio of about 24 billion globally, working in about 100 countries across the world, targeting small-scale farmers, we really see the power of these rural business owners. So I think that when you look at kind of the reach, you could say we're reaching about 100 million people in 2023. It's also important to look at the depth. What do you mean by you're reaching this person? You also have to increase their crop yields, increase their access to markets, increase their incomes. These are things that crop receipts can all directly impact. And those are things that we have a goal to increase and have indeed done so by at least 30% when we have an intervention. So it's reach, but it's also depth of the reach. And crop receipts are a valuable tool in doing that. So the second thing I'd like to talk about is just looking at farm to fork solutions. And here I'd like to take you with me to start digging in the dirt, this time in India, in Maharashtra. So this is a vast state, if you can imagine, about 300,000 square kilometers. It's coast, plateau, and mountains. It's home to 112 million people. And for these farmers, EFOD has a very holistic approach where we are working with them in cooperatives, as was discussed, before by Will, the importance of looking at cooperative farming. It's something that's done in many, countries around the world. And starting with, every stage of their work. So starting with planting, the crop, let's say lentils in this case, how to use more climate resistant seeds, how to do interventions on drip water irrigation, how to plan for dry season water catchment, how to use machinery and technology to ease workloads, to have better fertilizer and targeted water reuse, how to harvest, but then taking the crops through licensing, packaging, marketing to really go up the value chain and have that impact so that we're moving from subsistence farming to real agri-businesses. And I think the lesson is really clear that access to finance, capacity building, infrastructure, technology, and strong market linkages are all absolutely critical. And, as been said, if we're really serious about this, we also need to be bringing in the private sector, not as a bystander, but really more as a catalyst. The timing, when we looked at the legal guide, I think was really clear. The timing of finance is not the same in agriculture, is not the same as the timing of finance, in manufacturing, where, if really needed, you can kind of close your factory and then turn it on like a week from now. Farmers need finance not after the harvest, not during the harvest when value is starting to be realized. They need it before, when they have to purchase seeds, when they need fertilizer, when they need to pay labor. And the risks are extremely high, especially when one factors in increasing climate and other risks. And so I think that crop receipts are a really critical tool because they do precisely this. They're really, let's say, unlocking funding for pre-harvest production and ensuring farmers have the right time financing when they need it the most. And effectively, it's also a risk mitigation tool for agriculture, and it aligns with the reality of agricultural financing. So third and finally, I'd like to just talk a little bit more about crop receipts and also warehouse receipts kind of on the ground. And I think that the knowledge guide is just going to be an incredibly useful tool. And I likewise support the work on the model law, which is, I think, a really important next step to speed up the reforms and attract investments in this area. So here, I wanted to mention a project that IFAD has been working on from 2015 to 2024 in Kenya, and it's the Cereal Enhancement Program. So here, we can travel to Kenya and start digging into the soil there. This is not a coastal region. This is an internal region, and it's arid and semi-arid lands where the main crops are maize, sorghum, and millet, as well as associated pulses. And this project has a total financing of about 120 million from IFAD, from the Kenyan government and the European Union. And IFC and FAO have been really critical partners with us, offering technical advice and supporting capacity building really at the community level. And in this, we rolled out warehouse receipt system that really helped again, cooperative farmers come together to manage and sell their products through certified receipts. This was actually for pre-harvest, so it's kind of moving a little bit towards crop receipts for pre-harvest maize, sorghum, and millet. And that had a really important impact, giving access to markets and the finance where it was needed the most. And as Irene said at the beginning, we also worked around the creation of the governance and the registries with a receipt council system, a governance body that was tasked with maintaining a strategic and transparent system, and a central registry. And IFC was very helpful in providing technical advice on that. We can see the impact of this holistic approach, the type of seeds, climate proofing, work on the soil, irrigation, through to harvesting, through to the crop and warehouse receipts, really across the value chain. And it's really impressive, I think, that by 2024, over 100,000 Kenyan farmers had created sustainable agribusinesses due to this project. And this is a big reach, but again, it's the depth where we see the increase in crop yields, increase in income, and increase in market access. At the same time, we saw an important health impact, that malnutrition admissions to local clinics plummeted from 34% before the project to 8%. So really shows the importance of the impact on food security. So I really just want to thank everyone here today. Delighted to be part of this group and really committed to our collaborative work together going forward.
Well, thank you, Katie, for that excellent presentation and highlighting some of the early successes of your efforts, as well as the collaboration with various international financial and standard setters in all these initiatives. I should add that in the case of Kenya, I've also done some work, and some of the people on the call, attendees, supported some of these initiatives, such as the Financial Sector Deepening Trust of Kenya. So there is a lot of donor funding that helps achieve some of these results. The next on the agenda is Dmytro Prichodko from FAO. We are fortunate to have Dmytro with us today because he was part of the team 14, 15 years ago when the first phase of the project on crop receipts in Ukraine was initiated. So he will explain some of the challenges at the time to launch successfully a crop receipts project in Ukraine and elsewhere. Dmytro, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Marek. I join other speakers in congratulating Ili and IFC on completing the guide. I think it's been a big milestone. I understand that our colleagues from FAO, and I'm joined today by Carmen Boulon, our legal officer, who is in the participants. So, in fact, we worked with her on the Ukrainian first draft law on crop receipts. Well, maybe to go back to the origins before Kirilo came on board, and he mentioned he came on board in 2015. In 2010, FAO, IFC, and EBRD, supported directly by IFC and EBRD clients, organized a study tour for legislators, industry representatives, as well as government officials from Ukraine and Serbia to Brazil. And we have since then supported the development of the legislative framework. FAO was the first agency between, let's say, 2009, 2012 that put its own money from the technical cooperation program of FAO to finance drafting the law on crop receipts. So that technical cooperation program was conducted at the request of the Ukrainian government from 2011 to 2012. The first law on crop receipts was introduced into the Ukrainian parliament by parliament member Serhiy Tereshchuk, who was with us on the study tour. And here on the right-hand side, I hope you can see the slide. You can see the screenshot of the report in which we assessed the perspectives of introducing crop receipts. Since then, IFC and SECO stepped in big time. I would say the first SECO project with IFC, managed by Lea Soroka, Yelena Voloshina on the IC side, I think it was about $5 million, and that helped substantially to improve the legislative framework, provide training to public notaries. So it's been a long journey there. So the instrument started to pick up in Ukraine in about 2017, and by 2020, the peak of finance. And in here on this slide, you can see the statistics on crop receipts from Ukraine. It comes from the agro register. Many speakers before me talked about enabling environment, and the register of crop receipts was a critical element in this enabling environment, which IFC and SECO supported. It was initially placed with the Ministry of Agrarian Policy of Ukraine. So at the peak of the demand in 2020, 2022, there were about $500 million provided through crop receipts in financing. Of course, the full-scale invasion of Russia into Ukraine in 2022 led to substantial drop in the use of crop receipts. It was largely associated not because there was less demand, but because security conditions as well as overall financing situation has deteriorated very rapidly. So we've seen a substantial drop in the use of warehouse receipts. Kirilo mentioned a very good number of non-performing loans, which stood at 4% when it comes to crop receipts. And I think it's a good number. I don't have any statistics to support it, but the instrument has really helped to develop value chain finance in Ukraine, where off-takers of agricultural produce, either processors or input suppliers. And I'll mention two specifically here. One of the two early proponents of crop receipts in Ukraine were agricultural input suppliers, specifically Bayer and Syngenta. So these companies, they have used, to the best knowledge that we have, crop receipts to provide pre-harvest financing to their clients. As this way, they could secure payments for the agricultural inputs they have provided in an easy and in an easy manner and legally enforceable manner. They could also then use this to refinance their obligations elsewhere. So, but at the same time, what we've seen is that the legal practice around crop receipts has ballooned. So if someone looks today into the register of court decisions of Ukraine, and here you can just see a screenshot from the query window, and types crop receipts or agrarian receipt, there will be quite a few searches coming up. And I just pulled one of these searches and put it, it was about a 50-page document from the Supreme Court of Ukraine, and I grinded it through artificial intelligence to ask 4 simple questions. How the agrarian receipt secured the recovery of the financing provided when it was contested. So, and the financing was provided for the production of 119 tons of sunflower seed. Were the borrowers right? In this case, the farmers right? Were they deprived? What was the role of the notary, and what was the timeline and final outcome of this discussion? And what I was surprised is that the system worked really well and relatively fast. Speaking from the end of it, from the timeline of the first court appeal to the Supreme Court decision, and I'm talking about 3 levels of courts here, what we've seen is that it has taken only 9 months for the legal system to reach the final decision on this. And the Supreme Court confirmed the endorsement or writs of the notary for the enforcement of the crop receipts. The cassation court also dismissed the claims as well as the final decision was made. So that actually showed that the legal system around crop receipts has worked well, but at the same time, it shows that there are very many cases for legal professionals to look into in Ukraine, specifically where data is available, to see what specific issues stood up in the implementation. Maybe coming back to what hasn't worked well. In parallel, we worked on a similar legal framework with our partners in Serbia. And when I say our partners, Investment Center of FAO works with the World Bank Group, EBRD, IFAD. We support annually about $7 billion worth of investment. So in Serbia, what we saw is that participants linked and mentioned warehouse receipts. Warehouse receipt is a more secure financial instrument. Unfortunately, because there is a crop pledged and this crop is stored at a licensed warehouse, that instrument has had a very bumpy introduction in Serbia. There was no indemnity fund set up by the government to support it, or actually there was an indemnity fund to support it, but it wasn't actually functional. That really undermined trust in a similar financing instrument to crop receipts, which was supposed to be even more secure. Second thing, I think, before everyone moves in, it would be important to really conduct a solid demand analysis for crop receipts, as we did in Ukraine. So to me, demand and assessment of liquidity in the system, assessment of the need for value chain finance, they would be very important before proceeding with introducing crop receipts. Because what happened in Serbia is that the banking system around the time of the introduction of the crop receipts 2014 it has been fairly liquid, and there were funds also available from the government, from the EU pre-accession funds to farmers. So this has somewhat reduced the motivation for the adoption of this new and relatively untested instrument in Serbia. So I think with that, I'll stop and I'll answer any questions if there are any. And over to Marek.
Well, thank you very much, Dmitry, for highlighting some of the statistics as well as court cases that discuss various aspects of crop receipts. I'll turn over the floor quickly to John Wilson, who will describe some of the activities of the IFC as well as the project in Peru. John?
Thank you, Mark. Do you hear me okay?
Yes, please proceed. We can hear you well.
Great. I have some slides as well. Can you tell me if you can see the slides? Okay, perfect. Well, thank you very much. I mean, from IFC, I'd also like to celebrate here in the region the launch of this knowledge guide. And obviously thank ILI and thank the other participants in the development of what we think will be a very useful tool when we're working on the ground in economies and developing reforms and trying to incentivize the growth in agricultural finance via the use of crop receipts. So I think it's a great moment, and we will have eventually a model law, but for the time being, I think that the knowledge guide will definitely assist in the implementation and technical assistance work that we'll be doing. For my remarks, I'd like to focus very quickly on the evolution of crop receipts in Latin America, and in particular with regard to the implementation of a crop receipts system that we're currently partnering with SECO in Peru. And just to mention a couple of things I think that are important with regard to the evolution, not just in Latin America as a model to follow in Brazil, but Brazil actually was one of the first economies that had launched a crop receipt system. And I think that that has served as a model for some of the reforms that have taken place in Latin America, being that Brazil plays such a significant role, I think, and is viewed as a model for other states to follow. But also a lot of the knowledge that has come out of the Brazilian experience has been included, obviously, in the guide. And the important here is that also the evolution that Brazil has experienced from paper-based crop receipts to digital crop receipts, and the evolution from bank-based finance or individual financial institutions to financing through the capital markets with those digital tools. And I think that, like I mentioned, I'll go pretty quickly through the slides, but we'll share the slides at the end of the webinar and you can go through in more detail. But as you can see from the evolution of in the early 1990s, when the crop receipt was initially promoted in Brazil, the securitization law that provided for the pooling of these types of assets and then the digitalization of those assets themselves is what really permitted this transition, if you will, from bank financing to capital markets financing. And as you can see, the growth has been from approximately 3 billion before the securitization, and even a growth of 300% after the digitalization and securitization to 31 billion in financing with crop receipts in Brazil. Obviously, the Brazilian situation is a huge economy with many additional factors that contribute to the growth of this instrument and not necessarily replicable in other markets. But I think the important thing here is the evolution toward the digitalization of crop receipts, not just the development of the paper-based model, and the inclusion of capital markets as part of that financing plan, and to try to bring in additional private capital into the framework for smallholder farmers. With regard to Peru, what we've seen, and in working together with SECO, we've seen the need for crop receipts and the development for crop receipts in the increased demand by smallholder farmers and the different categories, which I'll mention in a second, because the smallholder farmers obviously play a significant role in food security, as has been mentioned already, But there is no pre-harvest finance mechanisms that are very effective in Peru. So the growth in the demand from the demand side for financing from crop receipts is viewed as the additional 37% of financing demand would occur with the establishment and the launch of a new crop receipt system. And this is within 5 principal market segments where we have seen the greatest demand for the instrument. The first, obviously, is producers with 5 hectares or less. But it's also obviously been with producers that haven't had a previous credit. And I think that this is where we really want to focus. But many of the other larger producers, including export producers, have a great need for pre-harvest finance as well, and we have seen the potential growth of financing via the use of crop receipts after their development. Another thing of note here is obviously with the development of sustainability and green crop receipts and the tagging of green crop receipts, that demand would also grow. We don't have the same numbers and even the same potential as Brazil, but obviously one of the things that we're seeing in the potential growth of financing is from 900 million annually to 3.5 billion US financing for these 5 segments in the first 3 years of operation. And maybe a couple of final words in terms of the impact that it can actually have on the ground has to do with, since this is a pre-harvest finance and you can use it for crop inputs, the producers have a significant increase in crop yield, which we see at approximately 5% nationally and 25% at the smallholder segment. But it's not just an increase in yield, but also an increase in crop quality. And this allows the smallholder producers obviously to derive even greater income because what they're producing actually is better agricultural products. Now, I won't go into the role of the knowledge guide. I think enough has been said in terms of like the different components themselves. But where we do want to focus, obviously, is working toward the digitalization of these types of assets for the authentication, the traceability, the electronic transfer, the electronic control of the payment, and then the electronic registration, right? And just to finalize, this is kind of like an IFC project that we've worked on in Brazil that we want to replicate obviously in other countries in Latin America, where we have the proof of concept of how securitization can actually work with some of the smallest producers, even in the Amazon region, right? We're talking about small, informal, smallholder farmers that have limited rights to use the land, in many instances, land tenure issues, but yet you're still able to take these producers, issue crop receipts under the digital crop receipt system, work with aggregators to take these crop receipts, obviously provide the financing, the creation of a financial instrument with a crop receipt that can then be pulled through a structure or other type of special purpose vehicle in which IFC and other EFOD and other institutions can obviously benefit from investment. And this is what eventually we feel will have the greatest impact on the ground, is if we can not only combine the crop receipt together with all of these other mechanisms that have been mentioned before, but also talk about how we can include financing through the capital markets to this smallholder segment. I'll pass it over back to you, Marek. I will have to drop off now, but thank you very much, and congratulations again, and thanks to ILA for all the help in the guide.
Well, thank you, John, for being so efficient and communicating so many important messages in the span of 6 to 7 minutes. I'm going to turn over the floor to our final panelist on this segment, Kevin Kabadze from Rabo Partnerships. And Kevin will describe to us their initiative exploring the potential of crop receipts, particularly in several African economies. Kevin?
Yeah, thank you for having us. And special thanks, of course, to IFC and ILI on this knowledge guide. I am conscious of the fact that I think people have been listening for 90 minutes. So I should also mention that I cannot see everybody. So if you need to stand and stretch while I speak, I will not hold it against you. So yeah, Rabo Partnerships, we are a 100% subsidiary of the Rabobank Group. For those who might not know, Rabobank is a Dutch-based global food and agriculture bank. So of course we're so well represented here by the multilaterals, but I think it's also great that from the private sector I'm able to be present. That brings me a little bit to the conversation today, which is on crop receipts. And why specifically I'm joining the call is because I'm the program manager leading with our partnership together with the Gates Foundation on crop receipts in sub-Saharan Africa. A little bit of context behind this project is in 2024, together with the Gates Foundation, we launched a partnership where we wanted to see how to effectively catalyze finance towards the agriculture sector as an agriculture bank. It's our bread and butter, and this is also from the agriculture development side of the Gates Foundation, something really important as an enabling factor. And so we conducted a very sort of hands-on research. We went globally. We did roundtables in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. And the solution that we really sort of settled on was crop receipts. So learning from the experience from our colleagues from the IFC, specifically Kirilo, who has been so generous with his time, but also with a lot of engagement with BNDES in Brazil, we really got to see that this might be the kind of solution that we might be able to implement in Africa. How, where, what was then what followed last year. And in the year 2025, we started a feasibility assessment to say, if we're going to do this in Africa, what's that going to look like? What kind of problems are we trying to solve? And we really sort of focused on two elements, which is the alternative collateral question, because primarily agriculture finance and rural finance in Africa is focused on or at least is backed by physical collateral, usually titled land. And scalability-wise, if you're talking about smallholder farmers, that's not really an option. And second, from the value chain perspective, very often there's a big question on contract integrity. So side selling and all other kinds of commitment questions sometimes are valid, and sometimes with moral hazard, farmers not always redeeming contracts they've signed. How we can find a solution to this. And I think crop receipts as a solution really play a really good option. And so we sort of did a broader analysis of which African countries could this potentially be launched in under, of course, some of the guidelines and support we're getting from IFC and from different colleagues, also from an organization called Senfree. I think some of them are joining us today. We sort of wanted to compare, and if you think about it, I'm speaking to you now from Amsterdam in the Netherlands. There are Brazilian farmers who have, farm holdings the size of North Holland, or the province that Amsterdam is in, for example. Whereas in contrast, the average size of a farm in Rwanda is less than 0.3 hectares per farmer. So any kind of sort of scalable solution has to take into account the on-ground environment. So we basically settled on 3 countries after doing an entire sort of continent-wide analysis of where this could happen. And we focused on Ethiopia, Rwanda, and Nigeria. And we really sort of looked at it from 3 major perspectives. So looking at the value chain dynamics. So how exactly are the value chains structured? And crop receipts, both from a financial institutions perspective, but also from the value chain perspective, what kind of role could it play there? We took a very keen focus on the regulatory and legal environment. What kind of legislation is currently existing that can be piggybacked on or needs to be further expanded? Again, I think the model law and the knowledge guide is going to be very instrumental in that front. And then lastly, a big question on DPI, so digital public infrastructure. If we aim to have crop receipts in one of these African geographies, it can only happen with the right kind of digital scaling, digital registry, and the level of farmer profiling needs to be captured in a digital platform. And so where are these countries and how to make that work? So we're currently finalizing that. So we have, I think, a pretty broad view, at least on these 3 countries. And the objective now in the coming year is to hopefully get started. And that's why this knowledge guide is quite critical for us. And we also touching points with IFC, trying to see what we can learn from the work that has been done till this point. And so I think just in wrapping up, to make sure we have enough time for questions, I'm grateful for everyone who is joining this session, and I hope to connect further with the folks from SECO, FAO, IFC, as we look to get into these African geographies with crop receipts. We want to sort of hopefully hit the ground running, and so once we have clarity on that, I really hope to touch base again. But I think I will leave it there for now. And yeah, thanks, Marek, for having us, and for everyone else for joining.
Well, thank you, Kevin, for highlighting the important role of other players. Historically, these types of reforms have been funded through IFC by SECO and other agencies, but we see an important role that foundations and entities such as yours play in this entire process, and we are grateful that you have been able to join this program, and we are also grateful that for your willingness to collaborate. As often we have even heard today that several of these projects have delivered the desired results because institutions collaborated and ensured that individual pieces of the project have been delivered very efficiently. That brings us to the final segment of the program, which is Q&A. And I first want to acknowledge the many questions that we have received through the chat. While you were all talking, I was busy answering all those questions, and there are a few that I thought I would pose to the panel, and also summarize the types of questions that have been already posed in the chat. But before I do that, I want to highlight one additional element from the panel discussion. As we said, crop receipts are an important element in a value chain. It's an important pre-harvest instrument that fulfills a critical role in moving the commodity along that value chain, ideally, eventually creating a receivable that is financed or the farmer actually getting paid. But John Wilson also highlighted in his presentation the financial, not so much financing, but the financial aspect of the financial infrastructure where a crop receipt is issued, such as to a supplier or seller of seeds or other products. And it is that seller and the holder of the crop receipt who uses it for its own financing. The financing institution, in turn, may sell a portfolio of these crop receipts to a vehicle to securitize them, to generate liquidity for its own operations by selling bonds. So crop receipts are not just an important part of the value chain, they are also a very important element in this financing market and the financing infrastructure. The second element that you, Kevin, highlighted yourself, as well as John and several other speakers, is digitalization and the existence of DPIs. All of these processes depend to a large extent on appropriate digital infrastructure, not just a legal infrastructure, but the existence of various registries, platforms, other systems that identify farmers. So we need to also ensure that all these infrastructures are properly implemented. Now to the questions themselves. So first, let me just summarize briefly and invite any of you from the panelists to provide any observations. So there were several questions raised concerning the legal aspects of crop receipts, which is very positive, as this is a relatively new legal area and people are still thinking through several legal issues, and we have not settled on conclusions on several of those issues. So those questions concerned priorities. If we have two crers, who wins? Those questions concerned penalties. What is an effective deterrent to the issuance of fraudulent crop receipts or other fraudulent activities, as well as enforcement? As we heard from several speakers, that contracts are often breached, and enforcement remedies are quite important, particularly in this sector where much of the produce is perishable and we need to get a swift remedy. So I would invite you to provide some observations, any of you, on what you see as a very effective mechanism that could be deployed to, for instance, resolve disputes or to deter conduct that could actually lead to those disputes, fraudulent or otherwise. So if anyone has any observations on those two types of questions, feel free to share with the attendees. I have already provided, so as to give you a minute or two to think through those questions, I have already provided my own insights in the chat. For instance, there was a specific question whether the law should include provisions for a specific court. And in my own experience in reforming access to credit laws, we have seen very efficient mechanisms by way of commercial courts. So depending on the volume of activities, it's probably more efficient to have a commercial court with specialized judges that are well versed in the intricacies of commercial laws, rather than have specialized courts for warehouse receipts, for crop receipts, and various types of financing mechanisms. There was also a question about penalties and the application of criminal laws that we often get, not only in the context of agricultural finance, but also in the broader context of agriculture, of finance and secured finance, such as using collateral for a loan with several lenders without informing them. So what are the effective deterrents to that type of conduct, whether criminal law is the most effective deterrent or some other mechanisms? My answer to that question was that, yeah, general criminal law applies. Typically, commercial laws are not filled with criminal law types of remedies, but general criminal law does apply. But the follow-up question concerned, well, are those remedies in fact effective enough, or should we be thinking more broadly? Particularly, this is a consideration for UNIDROIT going forward as to the nature of their instruments, which were focused on the private law issues, where we should go beyond that and provide for some regulatory actions, for instance, or some criminal law remedies. So these are some of the questions that the working group at UNIDROIT may wish to take into account. There was also a specific question, and I would pose this question to Dmytro and Kirill concerning the specific aspect of financing crop receipts in Ukraine. So from chat, from Bob Homans, what is the amount of a typical loan or terms and addition to the crop receipt? What are the sources of repayment? So if you can provide some illustration of what a typical crop receipt looks like, what sort of commodities finance? We have heard a bit about that, but can you tell us a bit more about the financial aspect of the crop receipt? And this is not just a question to Kirill and Dmytro in the context of Ukraine, but perhaps also Kevin can also, from his research, if they have researched this aspect, tell us a bit more about these types of aspects in Africa.
I can probably start, Mark, if you allow. So I will start with a statement on the crucial elements to make crop receipts successful. So first of all, is transparency. And this is what the register on crop receipts or any other infrastructure which we want to embed crop receipts into provides for transparency. So everyone sees how many crop receipts we issued, what's the value, what's the remaining outstanding balance, what's the payment discipline on that crop receipt. And this is very crucial. And avoid double pledging, right? So this is why we need to link the infrastructure on crop receipts to existing register on encumbrances, for example, of movable assets. So this is one crucial element. Second crucial element, digitalization. It's not because we just do digitalization for the purpose of digitalization. It's because we are aiming to decrease the transactional cost of issuance, because this is what is important when you work with smallholder farmers. you don't want to add on costs for issuing an additional financial instruments to attract investment. But also in the current environment, this is what helps to build the bridges with the existing databases, other public registers to extract the data and automatize the process as much as you can, right? To save time, to save money, to make it user-friendly for smallholder farmers, because we don't want to overcomplicate their life. We want to make it easy. And then enforcement is the third key pillar. And when we started crop receipt, it was done through the notarial writs, and it proved to be efficient. And I see Taras is on the call, is our key legal expert on Ukraine. And we monitor the court cases on the monthly basis. We see how it evolves. And as Dmitro rightly mentioned, the court practice is fully in favor of crop receipt, but it didn't come in the first year. The first 3 years, there were no defaults. We even wanted to make it artificial to test the concept, right? We did some simulations instead, because no one wanted to be the first defaulted farmer, for the records. And that what over time appeared to be very efficient. And now with the agrarian notes, we made the instrument itself an enforcement document by amending the law on enforcement, which makes this procedure even more streamlined. And this is very important. Going back to your question on what's the source of repayment, of course, these are the future cash flows generated by the crops which are relevant for the jurisdictions where we're implementing the crop receipt program. And in Ukraine, given the nature of the agricultural landscape where the export-oriented field crops are dominating, of course, they are shaping the agriculture finance landscape, and such crops as corn, sunflower, wheat, rapeseed are the key crops that are pledged on crop receipts. On top of that, we also wanted to prove the concept in other value chains, which are emerging in Ukraine, like orchards. Now we work with nut and berry agri-producer associations to expand that, because during the implementation of the project, 48 crops became collateral or the subject of crop delivery under the crop receipts. Of course, in other countries, there are different agricultural landscape, and now in Kosovo is completely different from Ukraine, but they also have well-established value chains which can be treated as very niche in Ukraine. For example, we have cucumbers, tomatoes, peppers. That requires an additional layer of sophistication, because these are really perishable products, and banks and MFIs want to work with them only if they're part of the value chain. If they have contracts with aggregators that in their turn have export contracts with other companies. So with that, they can provide some transparency in the value chain and predictability, right? So that's why the instrument is so universal. It can be tailored to any agricultural landscape, irrelevant of the land plot size and irrelevant of the crop.
Well, thank you very much, Kirill, for that exhaustive answer to that question concerning Ukraine. Dmitro and Kevin, do you have any additions to that answer?
Sure. Maybe I can be really brief. I think I agree totally with Kirillo's points on digitization and also on enforcement side, if we're talking about what makes crop receipts successful. From an African perspective, an element that's also quite important is the level of structure within the value chain. And that, on the one hand, is important for enforcement and also for transparency, but it's also very important for pricing. And the level of organization of the farmers, especially if you're talking about very small land holdings, a lot of the solution might have to be channeled through a cooperative. And so the level of structure, that there's a number of strong off-takers and input providers as opposed to a whole army of middlemen, I think can really make a difference.
Maybe just a few points, considering time from my side. I think Kirilo covered it really well. I don't think it would really work copying and pasting legal text of contracts from one country to another. I think there are big differences between physical crop receipt, or I mean the one that envisages physical product delivery versus the financial one. The terms would be different. Would be different. So I think when it comes to restricting the typology of courts, again, I'm not a lawyer, but what I've seen different types of courts handling cases involving crop receipts. These were mostly due to the fact that they may have different nature. It can be commercial, but there can be some criminal activities as well. And in terms of product coverage, I think, again, Kirilo mentioned it, 48 products in Ukraine. In Serbia, I remember at one point it was used, it was an anecdotal evidence from a colleague, but for apples, for instance. And here we have a big difference in terms of product coverage because unlike warehouse receipts, crop receipts can cover in their physical part pretty anything, like it can be even fish. But warehouse receipts usually require a standardizable product that can be easily stored for a relatively long period of time, for which it needs to maintain its qualities to preserve its value. So I hope that answers the problem.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And recognizing that we are already 4 minutes beyond the scheduled time, I'm going to give 30 seconds each to Will and Thomas to highlight one key lesson for all of us to keep in mind to ensure that crop receipts actually deliver on the promise. Will?
Thanks, Marek. Been wonderful to hear the support from everyone on the panel for future work in this area. I think clearly what everyone's been saying is that you have to take a jurisdiction by jurisdiction approach, and there's no magic bullet, but we do need some sort of further international legal harmonized guidance on what would be the ideal model, which then has to be, of course, adapted to each domestic circumstance, which is the beauty of flexible soft law instruments. Thanks, Marek.
Thomas?
For me, I think the one point that that I wanted to emphasize was just that this instrument can be used to finance the operations of smallholder farmers. And there's many examples in Ukraine and Brazil of how this instrument has used to finance the operation of smallholder farmers, especially at the pre-harvest stage. So I'm excited for this instrument to be deployed in practice in other jurisdictions. So looking forward to working with you all.
Well, that brings us to the end of the program. I want to thank all participants, both panelists and attendees, for contributing to the program. This is probably one of those very few webinars that I have been involved in where we had very lively discussion in the chat, and there have been few questions that I simply don't have time to answer. But thanks everyone for all your contributions once again, and we hope to organize one of these events in the near future to update everyone on what the progress has been in the interim with respect to facilitation of agriculture finance and specifically crop receipts. So on behalf of everyone, thank you.
Thanks everyone for participation. Thanks, Marek, for organizing such a great webinar, and hope to continue our great collaboration. Thanks everyone for your contribution.
Thanks and goodbye.